I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom, trying to decide what to wear to tonight's party. Damien said it was an important event, Clarissa's promotion at work, and needed to be celebrated properly. The blue dress seemed too dressy, the gray one too boring. In the end, I settled on a beige blouse and dark pants. Nothing special, but nothing provocative either. Clarissa always criticized my clothes, although she never said so directly. She just pursed her lips and turned away when I appeared in something bright or unusual. It was already getting dark outside, even though it was only 6:30. October days were getting shorter, reminding me that winter was approaching. I didn't like this time of year. Too many memories of Robert and I getting ready for the holidays, decorating the house, planning family dinners. Now everything had changed. The holidays had become a formality to be endured rather than celebrated. Sounds of cooking came from the kitchen. Clarissa was cutting something energetically, calling out to Damien from time to time. My son answered in monosyllables, clearly not in the mood to help. However, this had been his normal state for the past 6 months, ever since he lost his job at a construction company. Officially, he was laid off, but I suspected that it was not just a matter of cost cutting. Damien had always had problems with discipline and responsibility. Even in school, teachers complained about his inability to work in a team and his tendency to cause conflict. I put on some lipstick and stepped away from the mirror. 70 is a respectable age, but I didn't feel like a wreck yet. True, the arthritis in my knees reminded me of itself in the mornings, and my blood pressure sometimes spiked, but overall I was in good health. Robert always said that I had a strong constitution, inherited from my grandmother, who was a farmer. How I missed him, especially when I had to deal with my son and his wife. Robert knew how to find the right words and smooth things over. Without him, I felt defenseless against their coldness. Going downstairs, I headed for the kitchen. Clarissa was standing at the stove, stirring something in a large pot. Plates of appetizers were displayed on the table. Cheese, crackers, olives, everything looked quite appetizing, although I knew that most of it had been bought ready-made. Clarissa didn't like to cook, preferring to order food or buy semi-prepared meals. We were very different in that respect. I always cooked myself, even now, when I only had to cook for myself. "Can I help with anything?" I asked, coming closer. Clarissa turned around. Her dark hair was neatly styled, her makeup flawless. At 38, she looked attractive, although lately I had noticed harsh wrinkles around her eyes and mouth. Working at an insurance company was apparently not easy, or maybe it was something else, the constant tension she radiated while in this house. "Everything's under control, Estelle," she replied with a forced smile. "You can just stay out of the way. The guests will be here soon, and we need to get everything ready." I felt a slight twinge, but said nothing. Clarissa had always been a bit sharp, but today there was something particularly unpleasant in her tone. Maybe she was nervous about the promotion? Although, to be honest, I didn't really understand what had happened at her work. She explained it rather vaguely, something about a new position and a raise. When I tried to ask for more details, Damien quickly changed the subject. "Who are we expecting?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "A few of Clarissa's colleagues and my friends," came the reply from the living room. Damien was arranging chairs there. "10 people, no more." I nodded, even though no one could see me. 10 people in my house is already a small crowd. It's a good thing the house is spacious, which Robert and I acquired back in the 70s. At the time, we thought we would fill it with children, but fate had other plans. After Damien, I had 2 miscarriages, and the doctors advised me not to take any more risks. Damien remained our only child, and after my husband's death 5 years ago, a special kind of silence descended on the house. However, with Clarissa's arrival, the silence became less noticeable. They got married 3 years ago, quite quickly, and without any special ceremonies. Clarissa insisted on a modest registration at the city hall, arguing that big weddings were a relic of the past. At the time, I still hoped that marriage would change my son for the better, make him more responsible. Naive, of course. If anything changed, it was for the worse. Mom, could you not be too active? Damien appeared in the kitchen doorway, scratching the back of his head. It was a habit he had had since childhood. When he wanted to say something unpleasant, he always scratched the back of his head. He did the same thing when he had to explain another failing grade or a broken window in a neighbor's house. What do you mean? I tried to speak calmly, although inside I was already feeling the familiar knot of irritation and resentment rising. Well, don't tell everyone about my childhood. Don't butt into conversations. Just be, how should I put it, more modest. The guests are young. They're not interested in hearing about the old days. Clarissa nodded approvingly without turning away from the stove. I felt myself blushing. Was I really behaving inappropriately at their gatherings with friends? I thought I always tried to be tactful and unobtrusive. True, the last time Clarissa's colleagues came over, I did tell a funny story about how little Damien tried to make breakfast and almost burned down the kitchen. Everyone laughed then, but Damien himself was apparently not thrilled. Okay, I said briefly. I understand. Don't be offended, Estelle. Clarissa turned around after all. It's just that today is a special day. I want everything to go smoothly. You understand how important it is to make the right impression on colleagues. I left the kitchen, feeling like a stranger in my own home. This feeling had been haunting me more and more lately. When Damien lost his job, I offered them a place to stay until he found something new. 6 months ago, it seemed like a temporary solution. Now I realized that the temporary was dragging on, and they were in no hurry to change anything. In the living room, I fluffed the pillows on the sofa and dusted the coffee table, even though I had cleaned that morning. I needed something to occupy my hands. The house was getting ready to welcome guests. Damien turned on the music. Clarissa lit scented candles. Everything looked cozy and welcoming. I wonder if the guests will think about who really maintains this comfort, who pays for the electricity, gas, and everything else. I sat down in my favorite armchair by the window and picked up the book I had been reading for the last few days. It was a novel about a woman who, at the age of 60, decided to radically change her life. It was a rather banal plot, but something in it resonated with me. Perhaps it was because the heroine also felt invisible in her own family. She sold her house, bought a small cottage by the sea, and started writing detective stories. A brave woman, albeit a fictional one. The lights were already on outside the window. Our neighborhood in Fairfax was considered affluent. Neat houses with front gardens, wide sidewalks, old maple trees along the road. Robert and I chose this place precisely for its tranquility and respectability. At the time, it seemed important to live in a good neighborhood for Damien's sake. Now, many of our neighbors have changed, and young families with children have moved in. I watched them from the window and sometimes envied their energy and plans. Estelle, can you take your things off the dresser in the hall? Damien called out. Guests will hang their coats there. My things were keys, a few letters, and a small photo of Robert, which I had recently put there. The photo is especially dear to me. It shows him and me on the porch of this house on the day we moved in, young and happy. I silently gathered everything and took it to my room. I placed the photo on the bedside table next to other family photos. Robert looked at me with the same kind smile he had worn for 42 years. We married early. He had just graduated from college and was working as a junior accountant in a small firm. At the time, I dreamed of a career as a teacher, but when Damien was born, I had to put my plans on hold. Robert always supported me, saying that we would have time for everything. There was time, but for some reason I didn't take advantage of it. I kept putting things off. First until Damien grew up, then until he finished school, then college. The doorbell rang downstairs. The first guests had arrived. I heard voices, laughter, the clinking of glasses. Clarissa introduced someone to Damien, who responded in his usual slightly tense manner. My son had never been the life of the party, quite the opposite. He kept to himself, sometimes even rudely. When he was a child, I thought it would pass, that he was just shy. But as the years went by, his personality only got worse. I sat in my room a little longer, listening to the growing noise downstairs. The doorbell rang several more times, and there were more voices. Someone was telling a joke loudly. Someone turned up the music. Then I decided to go downstairs after all. It's my house after all, and I have the right to be present at a party in my own living room, even if I had been asked to not be too active. There were about 8 people in the living room, men and women around Damien and Clarissa's age. They all looked successful and happy with their lives. Expensive clothes, neat hairstyles, confident voices. I said hello and introduced myself as the host's mother. Most reacted politely, but without much interest. One man didn't even look up from his phone. Clarissa talked about her promotion, accepting congratulations. I stood a little to the side with a glass of juice and listened. Something about her story seemed strange. Too general phrases, vague details. New opportunities, expanded responsibilities, strategic planning. Fancy words with no real meaning behind them. But maybe that's just how her job is. I don't know much about the insurance business. Damien came up to me with a clearly forced smile. "How are you, Mom? Everything okay?" His tone implied a hidden request not to ruin their evening. I nodded and smiled in response. Let him think I understand the hint. Although in reality, I wanted to ask how long this charade would continue and when they would finally find their own place to live. By 8 o'clock, all the guests had gathered at the house. The living room was filled with voices and laughter, but I felt as if I were behind a glass wall. I was introduced as Damien's mother, and that was the end of their interest in me. The young people talked about work, the latest movies, their plans for the weekend, everything that made up their everyday lives and was completely foreign to me. I settled into the corner of the sofa with a glass of apple juice and watched. Among the guests was a red-haired woman in her 30s who, as it turned out, worked at the same insurance company as Clarissa. Her name was Hazel, and she chattered incessantly about some changes in the company, new clients, and difficult cases. Next to her stood a tall man with a short beard. Trevor, as he introduced himself, a friend of Damien's from college. Clarissa flitted among the guests, accepting congratulations and talking about her new responsibilities. But the more she talked, the more questions I had. The insurance company where she worked was small. I knew that. Clarissa had often complained about low pay and lack of prospects. And suddenly, such a rapid promotion? "Estelle, would you like to join me?" An elderly woman appeared beside me. It was Ruth, my neighbor from across the street. I didn't expect to see her here and was pleasantly surprised. "Ruth, I'm so glad you came," I said, genuinely happy to see a familiar face. "I didn't know you were invited." "Clarissa stopped by yesterday and said they were having a small celebration. I thought, why not come?" Ruth sat down next to me on the sofa. "To be honest, it's boring at home alone. Since Arthur died, I rarely go out." Ruth and I had been friends for over 10 years. She was widowed before me, and we often supported each other during difficult times. She was 74 now, but she looked lively, even though she complained about her health. "What exactly are we celebrating?" Ruth asked, looking around at the group. Clarissa explained something vague about work. I shrugged. "They say she got a promotion. I don't know the details either." At that moment, my gaze fell on Damien. He was standing by the window with a young man in a plaid shirt, talking quietly but emotionally about something. From time to time, he glanced at Clarissa, then at me. There was something alert, even anxious in his gaze. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away and pretended to be engrossed in conversation. Your son looks tense, Ruth remarked. Still unemployed? For now, I replied curtly. I didn't want to discuss Damien's problems, even with a close friend. He's looking for something suitable. In fact, I doubted he was looking at all. In 6 months, he had gone to 3 interviews, and all 3 times he was rejected. After that, the search somehow petered out. He spent his days at home, mostly on the computer, sometimes meeting up with friends. He lived off my pension and small savings, which were dwindling every month. Tough times? Ruth nodded sympathetically. My nephew is also having trouble finding work. The economy isn't what it used to be. Clarissa was passing by us with a tray of snacks at that moment. She looked lively and happy, but I noticed that her smile didn't reach her eyes. When one of the guests asked specific questions about her new job, she deftly changed the subject or laughed it off. Excuse me, she leaned toward Ruth and me. Would you like something to eat? There are still some shrimp left. Thank you, dear. Ruth took a cheese cracker from the tray. Congratulations on your promotion. What position will you be working in now? A shadow of irritation flashed across Clarissa's face, but she quickly regained her composure. Senior manager for corporate clients. Lots of new responsibilities, but the salary is commensurate. How wonderful, Ruth exclaimed. So you'll be able to get your own apartment soon? The question sounded quite innocent, but I saw Clarissa's shoulders tense up. We'll see, she replied dryly and hurried over to the other guests. Ruth looked at me in confusion. She clearly sensed the awkwardness, but didn't understand the reason for it. I didn't know how to respond either. The topic of moving was a sensitive one in our house, although no one spoke about it openly. The music was playing quite loudly, something modern and rhythmic. Several young people were even trying to dance in the small space between the armchair and the coffee table. Hazel laughed and told a story about a client who tried to insure his collection of garden gnomes. Everyone around us laughed, but I noticed that Clarissa's laughter sounded forced. Meanwhile, Damien moved to the bar, where he was pouring drinks. He had already had quite a bit to drink. You could tell by his red face and slightly unsteady movements. Alcohol always had a bad effect on him, making him aggressive and unpredictable. I hoped he would be able to control himself tonight. Mom, bring some more ice, he shouted across the room. I got up, but Ruth held me back. Sit down, Estelle. Let him go himself. It's okay, I'll be quick. I didn't want to cause a scene in front of the guests. In the kitchen, I took a bag of ice out of the freezer and poured it into a bucket. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Clarissa. She had followed me and was now standing in the doorway, looking around as if to check that no one could hear us. Estelle, we need to talk, she said quietly. But not today, tomorrow morning. About what? I felt uneasy. About plans, about the future. Clarissa spoke in riddles, but there was a note of determination in her voice. A lot is going to change. Damien and I have made some important decisions. Before I could ask any questions, she turned and left the kitchen. I stood there with the ice bucket in my hands, trying to understand the meaning of her words. What plans? What decisions? And why did she choose such a strange moment for this conversation? Returning to the living room, I gave the ice to Damien. He muttered something in thanks without even looking at me. At that moment, I caught his gaze directed at Clarissa. They exchanged glances, and there was a kind of understanding in that look, as if there was a secret agreement between them. Trevor was telling a story about his trip to California. He worked for a computer company and often traveled on business. He was an interesting speaker with a good sense of humor, but I couldn't concentrate on his story. I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening that I didn't understand. Hazel approached Clarissa and whispered something in her ear. In her ear. Clarissa nodded and discreetly pointed in my direction. Hazel looked at me curiously, then looked away. Another strange moment that added to the unease. Estelle, where is your bathroom? Asked one of the guests, a young blonde woman in a bright dress. Upstairs, first door on the right, I replied. Isn't there one downstairs? She asked again. Yes, over there, behind the kitchen. I pointed to the small powder room. But there's only a sink and a toilet. The blonde nodded and headed there. A few minutes later, I noticed that Damien had also disappeared. Then the blonde woman returned, and a couple of minutes later, his son appeared. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but it seemed to me that they were talking about something there. Meanwhile, Ruth was talking to an elderly man who turned out to be the father of one of Damien's friends. He had been brought along for company and, like Ruth and me, felt a little uncomfortable among the young people. They were discussing food prices and changes in the neighborhood over the past few years. I got up and walked over to the window where Damien had been standing earlier. From there, I could see the whole room and watch what was going on. Clarissa stood in the center of the group and talked animatedly, gesturing with her hands. Damien listened, standing slightly apart, but I noticed him glancing at his watch from time to time. Strange. He didn't usually keep track of time at parties and could sit until late at night. But today, for some reason, he was rushing things. When one of the guests suggested turning on the karaoke, Damien quickly refused, saying it was late and the neighbors might complain. At 9:30, some of the guests began to get ready to go home. Hazel and some guy were the first to leave. They had to get up early for work tomorrow. Then an elderly man, Damien's friend's father, got ready to leave. Ruth also got up and thanked everyone for a pleasant evening. Estelle, will I see you tomorrow? She asked as she put on her coat. Of course, I replied, although I didn't understand why she was asking. We saw each other almost every day anyway. Okay, come by if you need anything, she said, her voice taking on a strange tone, as if she wanted to say something else but couldn't bring herself to. By 10 o'clock, only 4 guests remained in the house. Trevor, the blonde in the bright dress, another guy, and a girl. They settled in the living room and continued drinking, talking louder and more freely. Clarissa took another bottle of wine out of the refrigerator. I felt tired. It had been a long day, and tomorrow I had a meeting with Clarissa, which I was anxious about. Maybe I should have gone to bed and left the young people to enjoy the party, but something kept me there, a vague uneasiness that had stayed with me all evening. By 10:30, the atmosphere in the house had changed noticeably. The remaining guests relaxed, talking louder and laughing more freely. Trevor settled on the sofa with a glass of whiskey and told some questionable jokes. The blonde, whose name was Jenny, turned out to be a beautician and talked incessantly about her clients. The third guy, Lance, had been Damien's friend since school, and the girl with him, Sherry, worked as a waitress at a local cafe. I sat in my chair, feeling increasingly out of place. The conversations revolved around topics that were foreign to me. The latest gossip from social media, problems at work, plans for the weekend. No one paid any attention to me, as if I were part of the furniture. It wasn't malicious, just the natural aloofness of young people toward an older woman with whom they had nothing to talk about. Clarissa brought a plate of leftover snacks from the kitchen and placed it on the coffee table. I noticed that the food was running low and decided to help. After all, this is my house, and I can't just sit idly by when there are guests to take care of. Would you like me to bring anything else from the kitchen? I asked, getting up from my chair. No, thank you, Clarissa replied quickly. There's plenty. But I was already on my way to the kitchen. There was a piece of cheese and some ham left in the refrigerator. I could make a few more sandwiches. I took out a cutting board and began to cut the cheese into thin slices. I heard footsteps behind me. Estelle, I told you, it's not necessary. Clarissa's voice sounded sharper than usual. It's no big deal, just a couple of minutes. I didn't turn around, continuing to cut the cheese. The guests are hungry and there's almost no food left. The guests are full. Clarissa came closer and put her hand on my hand with the knife. Stop fussing. Go and rest. There was something authoritative, compelling in her touch. I looked into her eyes and saw a coldness there that struck me. Clarissa had never been particularly warm, but now there was obvious irritation in her gaze. Okay, I said, putting the knife away. As you say. I washed my hands and left the kitchen, feeling like a child who had been scolded for taking inappropriate initiative. There was a lump of resentment in my throat, but I tried not to show my feelings. In the living room, the conversation had just turned to real estate. Lance complained about the high cost of renting. I'm lucky my parents let me live with them for now, he said. Otherwise, I'd be spending half my salary on a one-bedroom apartment in a bad neighborhood. And we live with Estelle, Damien interjected, nodding in my direction. We're still figuring out our housing situation. Everyone looked at me with polite interest. I smiled, not knowing what to say. Still figuring it out. Those words sounded as if finding their own place was their priority. In reality, they hadn't looked at a single apartment in 6 months. You have a big house, Jenny remarked. I'm sure there's enough room for everyone. Generally speaking, yes, I replied cautiously. Estelle is very hospitable, Clarissa added, but there was irony in her tone. True, sometimes a little too caring. Everyone laughed, and I felt a twinge. What did she mean? My attempt to make more snacks? Or something more general, my presence in my own home? The conversation moved on to another topic, and I was left out again. Trevor talked about his investments in cryptocurrency, and Sherry complained about rude customers at the cafe. Damien was quieter than usual, only occasionally interjecting with short comments. I noticed that he glanced at his watch several times. Around 11:30, I needed to use the restroom. The small room behind the kitchen was occupied. I could hear the sound of running water. I had to go upstairs. The bathroom on the second floor was more spacious, with a large mirror and comfortable furniture. Robert had renovated it himself 10 years ago, choosing the tiles and fixtures. As I was coming back down the stairs, I heard voices coming from the living room. Normally, I would have walked right past without listening, but something in their tone made me freeze on the last step. Damien was talking to Trevor, and they were standing by the window, with their backs to the stairs. The problem is that the old woman is living too long, Damien said quietly, but I heard every word. My heart skipped a beat. Was the old woman me? I cautiously took a step back, pressing myself against the wall. I couldn't see them from where I was, but I could hear their voices clearly. Are you serious? Trevor asked. She's your mother. So what? I didn't ask her to give birth to me, Damien said with such anger that I felt a chill inside. She's been a burden my whole life, always needing money or attention, and now she's taking over the house. Damn, don't be ridiculous. This is her house. For now, my son's voice took on a threatening tone. But not forever. Clarissa is right. We need to make a decision. I stood on the stairs, unable to move. Every word hit me like a blow. This was my own son talking about me as if I were an obstacle that needed to be removed. And what did do something mean? My thoughts were jumbled. My heart was beating so loudly that it seemed to be heard throughout the house. Listen, I don't want to get involved in this, Trevor said. This is your family business. Of course you don't. You have it easy. You live alone. No one bothers you. Damien had clearly had more to drink than he should have. Alcohol made him aggressive and outspoken. And I have to put up with her whining, her advice, her constant presence. I'm sick of it. I slowly climbed back up a few steps, trying not to creak the floorboards. I needed to go to my room and think about what I had heard, but my feet wouldn't move, as if they were glued to the spot. I wanted to hear the rest, to understand how serious their intentions were. "What does Clarissa suggest?" Trevor asked after a pause. "She has a plan," Damien replied. "She's a smart girl, unlike me. She knows how to act in situations like this." "What plan? What are they talking about?" I gripped the stair railing so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Music was playing in the living room, and the other guests were laughing and chatting, unaware of the conversation taking place by the window. "Just be careful," Trevor said. "Don't do anything stupid." "Don't tell me how to live my life," Damien snapped. "You'd better worry about your own problems." The conversation was clearly coming to an end, and they could walk away from the window at any moment. I hurriedly climbed the stairs and hid in my room. My heart was pounding. My mouth was dry. I needed to sit down and collect my thoughts. I sank into the chair by the window and tried to calm down. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe they weren't talking about me. But who else could Damien be calling old woman? And what was Clarissa's plan? Outside the window, streetlights illuminated the empty street. The lights in the neighboring houses had already gone out. People were going to bed, preparing for a new day. And I sat in the darkness of my room, trying to understand how serious a threat my own son and his wife posed. The party continued downstairs. From time to time, loud laughter or someone's voice could be heard. Clarissa was explaining something, and Jenny was squealing with delight. Everything was happening as usual, but for me, everything had changed. I could no longer pretend not to notice the coldness and hostility. "The old woman is living too long." These words spun around in my head, giving me no peace. How could a son say such things about his mother? I gave birth to him, raised him, gave him everything I could. When he was little, he loved me, clung to me when he was scared or in pain. What happened? When did love turn to hate? I got up and went to the dresser where the old photographs were kept. In one of them, little Damien was sitting on my lap, smiling at the camera. He was about 5 years old, his cheeks rosy, his eyes shining with happiness. Where had that child gone? How had he turned into a person who considered his mother a burden? Maybe it was Clarissa's influence? She never loved me. That was obvious from the start. Perhaps she had gradually turned Damien against me, convincing him that I was interfering with their happiness. Women know how to manipulate men, especially weak-willed ones like my son. But even if that's the case, is it an excuse? Shouldn't a son defend his mother from his wife's attacks? Robert always took my side when his mother criticized me. Damien, it seems, has chosen a different tactic. Someone downstairs turned up the music. The bass reverberated off the walls, making the window panes rattle. I went to the door and listened. The voices sounded more cheerful. Someone was even singing. The party was in full swing, and no one was thinking about the workday ahead. I looked at my watch. It was 12:20 a.m. I usually went to bed much earlier, but tonight I couldn't sleep. My thoughts revolved around the conversation I had overheard, giving rise to new fears and suspicions. What was Clarissa's plan? What were they going to do? Maybe they wanted to force me to sign the house over to them, or sell it and split the money. The house was worth a decent amount, especially considering its location in a good neighborhood. That money could provide a comfortable life for several years, but I wasn't going to give up so easily. The house was all I had left of my former life with Robert. I had spent the best years of my life here, raising our son, making plans, dreaming of the future. No one had the right to take those memories away from me. Loud laughter and the sound of breaking glass came from downstairs. Someone had apparently dropped a glass. I heard Clarissa say something soothing. Then the sound of a vacuum cleaner. Life went on, the party continued, and I sat upstairs trying to figure out what to do next. By 10:30, the atmosphere in the house had changed noticeably. The remaining guests relaxed, talked louder, and laughed more freely. Trevor settled on the sofa with a glass of whiskey and told some questionable jokes. The blonde, whose name was Jenny, turned out to be a beauty salon employee and talked incessantly about her clients. The third guy, Lance, had been friends with Damien since school, and the girl with him, Sherry, worked as a waitress at a local cafe. I sat in my chair, feeling increasingly out of place. The conversation revolved around topics that were foreign to me: the latest gossip from social media, problems at work, plans for the weekend. No one paid any attention to me, as if I were part of the furniture. It wasn't malicious intent, just the natural aloofness of young people toward an older woman with whom they had nothing to talk about. Clarissa brought a plate of leftover appetizers from the kitchen and placed it on the coffee table. I noticed that the food was running out and decided to help. After all, this is my house, and I can't just sit idly by when there are guests to take care of. "Would you like me to bring something else from the kitchen?" I asked, getting up from my chair. "No, thank you," Clarissa replied quickly. "There's enough." But I was already on my way to the kitchen. There was a piece of cheese and some ham left in the refrigerator. I could make a few more sandwiches. I took out a cutting board and began to cut the cheese into thin slices. I heard footsteps behind me. "Estelle, I told you, it's okay." Clarissa's voice sounded sharper than usual. "It's no big deal, just a couple of minutes." I didn't turn around, continuing to cut the cheese. "The guests are hungry, and there's almost no food left." "The guests are full." Clarissa came closer and put her hand on my hand with the knife. "Stop fussing. Go rest." There was something authoritative, compelling in her touch. I looked into her eyes and saw a coldness there that struck me. Clarissa had never been particularly warm, but now there was outright irritation in her gaze. "Okay," I said, putting the knife away. "As you say." I washed my hands and left the kitchen, feeling like a child who had been scolded for taking inappropriate initiative. There was a lump of resentment in my throat, but I tried not to show my feelings. In the living room, the conversation had just turned to real estate. Lance complained about the high cost of renting. "I'm lucky my parents let me live with them for now," he said. "Otherwise, I'd be spending half my salary on a one-bedroom apartment in a bad neighborhood." "And we live with Estelle," Damien interjected, nodding in my direction. "We're still figuring out our housing situation." Everyone looked at me with polite interest. I smiled, not knowing what to say. Still figuring it out. Those words sounded as if finding their own place was their priority. In reality, they hadn't looked at a single apartment in 6 months. "You have a big house," Jenny remarked. "I'm sure there's enough room for everyone." "Generally speaking, yes," I replied cautiously. "Estelle is very hospitable," Clarissa added, but there was irony in her tone. "True, sometimes a little too caring." Everyone laughed, and I felt a twinge. What did she mean? My attempt to make more snacks? Or something more general, my presence in my own home? The conversation moved on to another topic, and I was left out again. Trevor talked about his investments in cryptocurrency, and Sherry complained about rude customers at the cafe. Damien was quieter than usual, only occasionally interjecting with short comments. I noticed that he glanced at his watch several times. Around 11:30, I needed to use the restroom. The small room behind the kitchen was occupied. I could hear the sound of running water coming from there. I had to go upstairs. The bathroom on the second floor was more spacious, with a large mirror and comfortable furniture. Robert had renovated it himself 10 years ago, choosing the tiles and fixtures. As I was coming back down the stairs, I heard voices coming from the living room. Normally, I would have walked right by without listening, but something in the tone of their voices made me freeze on the last step. Damien was talking to Trevor, and they were standing by the window with their backs to the stairs. "The problem is that the old woman is living too long," Damien said quietly, but I heard every word. My heart skipped a beat. Was old woman referring to me? I cautiously took a step back, pressing myself against the wall. I couldn't see them from where I was, but I could hear their voices clearly. "Are you serious?" Trevor asked. "She's your mother." "So what? I didn't ask her to have me," Damien said with such anger that I felt a chill inside. "She's been a burden my whole life. She always wants money or attention. And now she's taking over the house. Damn, don't be ridiculous. This is her house. For now." My son's voice took on a threatening tone. "But not forever. Clarissa is right. Something has to be done." I stood on the stairs, unable to move. Every word hit me like a blow. This was my own son talking about me as if I were an obstacle that needed to be removed. And what did "do something" mean? My thoughts were confused. My heart was beating so loudly that it seemed to be heard throughout the house. "Listen, I don't want to get involved in this," Trevor said. "This is your family business." "Of course you don't. You have it easy. You live alone. No one bothers you." Damien had clearly had more to drink than he should have. Alcohol made him aggressive and outspoken, but I have to put up with her whining, her advice, her constant presence. I'm sick of it. I slowly climbed back up a few steps, trying not to creak the floorboards. I should have gone to my room to think about what I had heard, but my legs wouldn't move, as if they were glued to the spot. I wanted to hear the rest, to understand how serious their intentions were. "What does Clarissa suggest?" Trevor asked after a pause. "She has a plan," Damien replied. "She's a smart girl, unlike me. She knows how to act in situations like this." "What plan? What are they talking about?" I gripped the stair railing so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Music was playing in the living room, and the other guests were laughing and chatting, unaware of the conversation taking place by the window. "Just be careful," Trevor said. "Don't do anything stupid." "Don't tell me how to live my life," Damien snapped. "Worry about your own problems." The conversation was clearly coming to an end, and they could walk away from the window at any moment. I hurried up the stairs and hid in my room. My heart was pounding. My mouth was dry. I needed to sit down and collect my thoughts. I sank into the armchair by the window and tried to calm down. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe they weren't talking about me. But who else could Damien be calling old woman? And what was Clarissa's plan? Outside the window, streetlights illuminated the empty street. The lights in the neighboring houses had already gone out. People were going to bed, preparing for a new day. And I sat in the darkness of my room, trying to understand how serious a threat my own son and his wife posed. The party continued downstairs. From time to time, loud laughter or someone's voice could be heard. Clarissa was explaining something, and Jenny was squealing with delight. Everything was happening as usual, but for me, everything had changed. I could no longer pretend not to notice the coldness and hostility. "The old woman is living too long." These words spun around in my head, giving me no peace. How could a son say such things about his mother? I gave birth to him, raised him, gave him everything I could. When he was little, he loved me. He would cuddle up to me when he was scared or in pain. What happened? When did love turn to hate? I got up and went to the dresser where the old photos were kept. In one of them, little Damien was sitting on my lap, smiling at the camera. He was about 5 years old, his cheeks rosy, his eyes shining with happiness. Where had that child gone? How had he turned into a person who considered his mother a burden? Maybe it was Clarissa's influence. She never loved me. That was obvious from the very beginning. Perhaps she gradually turned Damien against me, convincing him that I was interfering with their happiness. Women know how to manipulate men, especially weak-willed ones like my son. But even if that's the case, is it an excuse? Shouldn't a son protect his mother from his wife's attacks? Robert always took my side when his mother criticized me, but Damien seemed to have chosen a different tactic. Someone downstairs turned up the music. The bass reverberated off the walls, causing the window panes to rattle. I went to the door and listened. The voices sounded more cheerful. Someone was even singing. The party was in full swing, and no one was thinking about the fact that tomorrow was a work day. I looked at my watch. It was 12:20 a.m. I usually went to bed much earlier, but tonight I couldn't sleep. My thoughts revolved around the conversation I had overheard, giving rise to new fears and suspicions. What was Clarissa's plan? What were they going to do? Maybe they wanted to force me to sign the house over to them, or sell it and split the money. The house was worth a decent amount, especially considering its location in a good neighborhood. That money could provide a comfortable life for several years, but I wasn't going to give up so easily. The house was all I had left of my former life with Robert. I had spent the best years of my life here, raising our son, making plans, dreaming of the future. No one had the right to take those memories away from me. Loud laughter and the sound of breaking glass came from downstairs. Someone had apparently dropped a glass. I heard Clarissa say something soothing, then the sound of a vacuum cleaner. Life went on, the party continued, and I sat upstairs trying to figure out what to do next. Around 1 in the morning, I decided to go downstairs. Sitting in my room and agonizing over guesses was becoming unbearable. It was better to return to the guests and observe what was happening. Maybe I could figure out what Damien and Clarissa were up to. The atmosphere in the living room had become even more relaxed. Trevor was lying on the sofa with his feet up on the coffee table, telling some story about his boss. Jeannie was sitting on the floor, leaning against a chair, giggling at every sentence. Lance and Sherry were huddled in a corner, quietly discussing something, glancing at the others from time to time. Damien was standing at the bar with a bottle of beer in his hand. His face was red, his eyes glazed over from alcohol. When he saw me on the stairs, his expression changed. Instead of his usual indifference, I saw something resembling irritation. "Ah, Mom's downstairs," he said louder than necessary. "I thought you were already asleep." "I'm not asleep," I replied curtly and walked into the living room. Clarissa was coming out of the kitchen at that moment with a tray of snacks. When she saw me, she stopped and looked at Damien. There was a quick exchange of glances between them, the same silent conversation I had been observing all evening. "Estelle, aren't you tired?" Clarissa asked with feigned concern. "Maybe it's time to rest. It's been a long day." "I'm fine," I replied, settling into my chair. But I didn't feel fine at all. The conversation I had overheard was stuck in my head, and my son and daughter-in-law's behavior was becoming increasingly strange. They clearly wanted me to leave, but I wasn't going to indulge them. Trevor finished his story, and there was a short pause in the room. The music played softly. Someone finished their wine. The atmosphere was relaxed, but I felt an underlying tension, like before a storm. "Mom, could you bring some more napkins from the pantry?" Damien asked. "I think we're out." I looked at the coffee table. There was a whole pack of napkins there, almost untouched. "But there are plenty of napkins there," I said. "Those are paper ones," Clarissa quickly interjected. "We need cloth ones. For our hands, you know." It was a silly request, but I got up and went to the pantry. There were indeed cloth napkins there, left over from previous holidays. I took the pack and returned to the living room. Damien took the napkins and placed them on the table next to the paper ones. Now both types were on the table. None of the guests even looked in their direction. I realized that it was just an attempt to get me out of the room. The next half hour passed in awkward tension. The guests were entertaining themselves, but I could feel Damien and Clarissa's eyes on me. They whispered to each other and gave me meaningful looks. Trevor tried several times to engage me in conversation, but it felt forced. Estelle, how did you like living in this neighborhood before? Jenny asked, apparently trying to be polite. Very much, I replied. My husband and I moved here in '72. It was quieter then, fewer cars. And the house is big, Lance remarked. It must be expensive. Clarissa glanced quickly at him, then at me. A flicker of anxiety passed through her eyes. Lance, let's not talk about money, she said with a forced smile. It's okay. He waved her off. I'm just interested in real estate. I'm thinking of buying something of my own. The conversation about real estate clearly bothered Damien as well. He finished his beer and placed the bottle on the table with excessive force. Mom, maybe you should go to bed. It's late. I don't want to, I replied stubbornly. Damien looked at Clarissa, who nodded slightly. Between them, there was another silent exchange that had been unsettling me all evening. Mom, where are your spare towels? He asked suddenly. In the bathroom upstairs, in the cabinet, I replied, not understanding why he needed towels at this hour. Can you show me? The question sounded strange. Damien had been living in this house for 6 months and knew perfectly well where everything was. But something in his tone made me get up. Maybe he wanted to talk to me alone, to explain his behavior. I went upstairs, hearing my son's heavy footsteps behind me. In the bathroom, I opened the cabinet and pointed to the stack of towels. Here, clean ones on the bottom, used ones on top. Got it. Damien stood in the doorway and looked at me with a strange look. Is something wrong? I asked, sensing something was wrong. Instead of answering, he stepped into the bathroom and pushed me hard against the wall. I didn't expect this and didn't have time to resist. My back hit the tile, and Damien was already leaving the bathroom. What are you doing? I shouted, rushing to the door. But it was too late. Damien slammed the door and turned the key. I heard the lock click, trapping me inside. Damien, open up right now. I pulled on the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. Sorry, Mom. His voice came from behind the door. But you're ruining our fun. Stay here for now, and we'll let you out later. I couldn't believe what was happening. My own son had locked me in the bathroom like a naughty child. It was humiliating and scary at the same time. Damien, this isn't funny. Open the door. I pounded on the door with my fists, but there was no response. I heard footsteps on the stairs. He was coming down. I could hear music and the voices of guests downstairs. Life went on as if nothing had happened. I looked around. The bathroom was small, with one window overlooking the courtyard. The window was high up, and even if I could open it, it would be impossible to climb out. It was the second floor, a long way down. My heart was pounding. What were they up to? Why did they need to lock me up? Could it be that now, while I was locked up here, they were carrying out the very plan Clarissa had mentioned? I sat down on the edge of the bathtub and tried to calm down. I had to think logically, not give in to panic. I had my cell phone in my pocket. Robert insisted that I always carry it with me, especially after his death. In case of an emergency, he said. It seemed that such a situation had arisen. I took out my phone and saw that the signal was weak, but there was one. Who should I call? The police? But what would I tell them? That my son had locked me in the bathroom? It would sound like a domestic dispute, which the police would be unlikely to want to get involved in. Then I remembered Winifred, my best friend who lived 5 minutes away. We had been friends for over 20 years, saw each other almost every day, and she knew all about my family situation. If anyone would believe me, it would be her. Winifred was 2 years younger than me, but she looked younger than her 68 years. She had been widowed before me, and we had supported each other through difficult times. She was a practical woman, not prone to drama, but always ready to help in times of trouble. I found her number in the phone book and pressed call. Long beeps. She was probably asleep, which was not surprising. It was well past midnight. But someone picked up the phone. Hello? Winifred's sleepy voice was music to my ears. Winnie, it's Estelle, I said quietly, afraid of being heard downstairs. Estelle? My God, what time is it? What's wrong? I need help, I said quickly and quietly. Damien locked me in the bathroom. I can't get out. What? Repeat that. I didn't hear you. Damien locked me in the bathroom. They're having a party, and he said I'm in the way. Winnie, I'm scared. I don't know what they're planning. There was silence on the other end of the line. Winifred was probably trying to process what she had heard. Our friendship was built on complete trust, but even she might doubt such a story. Estelle, are you serious? Your son locked you in the bathroom? Yes, and tonight I heard him talking to a friend. He said that the old woman has lived too long. My God. Winifred sighed. Okay, I'll be right there. Hang in there. Thank you, I whispered. Just be careful. I don't know what they're capable of. I hung up and leaned against the wall. Help was on the way, but I had to hold out until it arrived. Music and voices could still be heard from below. I wondered if any of the guests had noticed my disappearance, or had Damien and Clarissa come up with some kind of explanation. I pressed my ear against the door and tried to hear what was going on downstairs. The voices sounded normal, and no one could be heard on the stairs. Maybe they told the guests that I had gone to bed. It would seem natural at such a late hour. Time dragged agonizingly slowly. Every minute felt like an hour. I looked out the window, peering into the dark street, waiting to see the headlights of Winifred's car. But the street remained empty, lit only by dim street lights. What were they doing down there while I was locked up here? Searching my room? Looking for the will or the deeds to the house? Or maybe just having fun, rejoicing that they had gotten rid of the annoying old woman? Thoughts swirled in my head, giving rise to new fears. How far were they willing to go? What if they decided that imprisonment alone was not enough? Damien always had problems with self-control, especially when he drank. I tried to open the window, but it wouldn't budge. Apparently, the sashes had stuck over time. Even if I had managed to open it, shouting would have been useless. The neighboring houses were far away, and no one would have heard me. My only hope was Winifred. I sat on the edge of the bathtub in complete silence, except for the muffled sounds from the first floor. The music was playing more quietly. The voices sounded more subdued. Apparently, the guests had begun to disperse or had simply grown tired of the festivities, and I remained locked in this small room, like a criminal in my own home. Outside the window, rare clouds floated slowly by, covering and uncovering the moon. When the moonlight penetrated the bathroom, everything around me took on a ghostly appearance. The white fixtures seemed even whiter, and the mirror reflected my pale figure. At moments like this, what was happening seemed unreal, like a bad dream from which I could wake up. But as soon as I tried to open the door, reality returned with all its cruelty. The lock wouldn't budge, the handle turned idly. Damien had taken great care to ensure that I couldn't go anywhere. I wonder when he planned to release me. Or did he plan to at all? The thought that my son could seriously harm me seemed absurd just a few hours ago. But after hearing the conversation and what had just happened, I was no longer so sure. Damien had changed, and not for the better. The boy I had raised was gone, replaced by a stranger, a hostile man. I got up and walked over to the mirror. The reflection showed me an elderly woman with disheveled hair and frightened eyes. 70 years is a long time, during which one can learn a lot about life, but I still didn't understand where I had gone wrong with my son. Maybe I spoiled him too much, or on the contrary, was I too strict? Robert always said I was a good mother. Estelle, you're doing everything right, he would repeat when I doubted my parenting methods. After another of Damien's escapades, when he got into a fight at school or got a bad grade, I would blame myself for not paying enough attention or being too lenient, but my husband would reassure me. Kids go through difficult periods, he'll grow out of it. Did he grow out of it? At 45, my son was unemployed, living off me, and considered me an obstacle to his happiness. If this is the result of growing up, then something went wrong in his childhood. I sat back on the edge of the bathtub and closed my eyes, trying to remember Damien as a little boy. He was a cute kid with dark hair and big eyes. He loved building blocks and could spend hours building castles and cars out of them. When he was 7, he dreamed of becoming an architect like Uncle Frank, Robert's brother. He drew houses with lots of windows and tall towers. What happened to those dreams? When did he stop building and start breaking things? As a teenager, he started having problems with his studies, then with discipline. He got involved with the wrong crowd and started skipping school. Robert and I tried to talk some sense into him, but he only distanced himself from us. Things went a little better in college. Damien chose construction, and I hoped that his childhood dream of architecture would finally come true. But he graduated without much enthusiasm, worked on various construction sites, and changed jobs frequently. His employers complained about his disorganization and confrontational nature. And then Clarissa came along. I remember our first meeting. He brought her to Sunday dinner and introduced her as a special friend. She was beautiful, confident, and talked about her career in an insurance company. It seemed to me that she could be a good support for him, help him stabilize. How wrong I was. Clarissa didn't stabilize Damien. She used him. She quickly realized that his mother had a house and savings and focused all her efforts on gaining access to them. And Damien, weak-willed and infantile, became her obedient tool. I heard the sound of a door slamming downstairs. One of the guests had left. Then another. The party was coming to an end. I wonder what Damien and Clarissa will say when everyone leaves? That I'm sick and went to bed? Or will they come up with something more sophisticated? I listened to the sounds in the house. The voices were getting quieter, less frequent. Someone was laughing in the hallway saying goodbye. Then I heard the sound of car engines. The guests were leaving. Another 10 minutes passed, and the house was plunged into relative silence. Only somewhere downstairs, music was playing quietly, and muffled voices could be heard from time to time. Damien and Clarissa were left alone. Suddenly, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Someone was coming upstairs, trying to tread quietly. The footsteps stopped at my bedroom door. Then I heard the hinges creak. Someone entered my room. I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, trying to hear what was happening. The bedroom was about 5 meters down the hall, but in the silence of the night, the sounds carried clearly. Someone was moving cautiously around the room, looking for something. I heard the creak of a dresser drawer, then another. Someone was methodically searching through my furniture. My heart began to beat faster. So, my guess was right. They were really looking for something in my things while I was locked up and unable to stop them. What exactly were they looking for? A will? Documents for the house? Bank accounts? I didn't have anything particularly valuable except the house itself and a small nest egg for a rainy day. But for Damien and Clarissa, this was apparently of interest. The sounds from the bedroom continued. Now someone was rummaging through the closet. I could hear clothes hangers being moved and plastic bags rustling. Then there was a dull thud, probably a heavy box of winter clothes being moved. I remembered what was in my drawers and closets. Old letters from Robert, photographs, medical records, receipts for bills. The will was kept with a notary, and I only had a copy at home, which I kept in a folder with other important documents. That was probably the folder they were looking for. It contained copies of documents for the house, bank statements, insurance policies. Not confidential information, but enough to understand my financial situation. The footsteps moved to the dressing table. I heard the sound of drawers being pulled out. It contained my few pieces of jewelry, Robert's wedding ring, which I had taken off after his death, and a few old brooches, a gift from my mother. Nothing particularly expensive, but sentimental. Then the footsteps moved toward the bedside tables. One contained books and reading glasses, the other medicines and a thermometer. Nothing of interest to burglars, but they were clearly searching everything. After about 20 minutes, the sounds from the bedroom subsided. I heard cautious footsteps in the hallway. Someone was going downstairs. Muffled voices could be heard downstairs. Damien and Clarissa were talking about something. I strained my ears, trying to make out the words, but they were speaking too quietly. Only occasionally did I hear individual phrases. Didn't find it. Try tomorrow. There must be some in the bank. So, the search had been unsuccessful. Whatever they were looking for, they hadn't found it. That reassured me a little. At least they hadn't got what they wanted yet. The conversation downstairs continued, but I could no longer make out individual words. Only a general hum of voices and intonations. From the tone, I could tell they were discussing plans, perhaps arguing about what to do next. I looked out the window again, watching for Winifred's car. How much time had passed since the call? Half an hour? More? It seemed like an eternity, but in reality, time was passing agonizingly slowly. Winifred lived nearby, but at such a late hour she had to get dressed, start her car, and perhaps call the police first. I hoped she understood the seriousness of the situation and wouldn't try to solve the problem on her own. It was getting chilly in the bathroom. The heating was uneven, and the temperature on the second floor was always lower than downstairs at night. I regretted not bringing a sweater. When Damien called me upstairs, I didn't think I would be staying here for long. I got up and paced around the room a little, stretching my stiff legs. The bathroom was small, only a few steps from wall to wall, but the movement helped me warm up and kept my thoughts from freezing in one place. In all the years I had lived in this house, I had never been in a situation like this. Even as a child, my parents never locked me up as punishment. They preferred conversation and explanation to physical coercion, and now my own son had turned me into a prisoner in my own home. How low he had fallen, and how blindly I had turned a blind eye to his shortcomings, excusing them with circumstances, stress, his wife's influence. It was time to face the truth. My son had become a person capable of betrayal and cruelty. This thought caused me acute pain, but there was also a kind of bitter clarity in it. I no longer had to pretend that everything was fine, to look for excuses for his behavior, to hope for a miraculous change. He had chosen his path, and that path led him against me. Downstairs, the conversation seemed to have ended. I heard footsteps. Someone walked down the hall, then a door slammed. Damien and Clarissa went about their business or went to bed, and I was still sitting in confinement, waiting for help. But I no longer felt like a victim. On the contrary, anger rose in my chest, cold, conscious, empowering. Do they think they can treat me like a thing? That I will meekly endure any humiliation? How wrong they are. 70 years of life have taught me something. And one of the main lessons was that no one has the right to control your destiny, even if that someone is your own child. After about an hour of waiting, I saw the long-awaited headlights in the window. 2 cars stopped outside my house, one ordinary, dark-colored, the other with police markings. A familiar figure, Winifred, got out of the first car, and two men in uniform got out of the second. One was older, heavy-set, with gray hair, the other young and fit. They talked to Winifred about something, then all three headed for the front door. My heart began to beat faster. Help had finally arrived. But what would Damien say? How would he explain my absence? And would the police believe my version of events? The doorbell rang. Once, insistently, then again. There was a rustling downstairs, followed by hurried footsteps. Someone spoke in a hushed voice. Probably Damien and Clarissa, discussing who would go and open the door. The bell rang a third time, longer and louder. The police weren't going to wait. Finally, footsteps approached the door, followed by the sound of locks turning. The door opened. "Yes, how can I help you?" Damien's voice sounded surprised, but I detected a note of tension in it. "Good evening," said one of the police officers in a formal voice. "Officer McCormick, Fairfax Precinct. We received a report that something suspicious may be happening in this house. May we come in?" "Suspicious? What are you talking about?" Damien's voice sounded frightened. "Nothing suspicious is going on here. We had a small party, and the guests have already left. We'd like to speak to Estelle Crispin," Winifred added. "Is she home?" There was a pause. I imagined my son's face at that moment. Confusion, trying to come up with a plausible explanation, realizing that his plan was falling apart before his eyes. "Mom, yes, of course she's home," he finally said, trying to sound confident. "She's already asleep. What's the matter? Have the neighbors complained about noise?" "No, it's not about noise," replied the second officer. "We need to make sure Mrs. Crispin is okay. Please wake her up." "Look, I don't understand what this is about." Damien's voice was becoming more sharp. "What could be the problem? My mother is a healthy adult. She's at home." "That's exactly why we need to talk to her," Officer McCormick interrupted him. "Either you bring her out, or we'll go in and find her ourselves." I heard Damien clear his throat nervously. Okay. Wait a minute, I'll go get her." I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, heavy footsteps. Damien was going upstairs, clearly stalling for time and figuring out what to do next. A few seconds before he reached my door, I heard his voice. "Mom? Mom? Are you asleep?" He was clearly putting on a show for the police downstairs. Then he knocked on my bedroom door. "Mom, you have visitors." Of course, there was no answer. He knocked again, louder. Strange, she usually wakes up easily. Then I heard his footsteps toward the bathroom door. He stopped right behind it, and I heard him whisper, "Mom, the police are here. If you don't tell them right now that everything is fine, there will be big problems. You understand?" The threat in his voice was unmistakable. He was trying to intimidate me, to keep me quiet until the very last moment. But the game was over. "Help!" I shouted with all my might. "Help! I'm locked in the bathroom." There was immediate commotion downstairs. Loud voices, quick footsteps. The police were coming up the stairs. "Mom, what are you doing?" Damien hissed. "Here, I'm here." I continued to shout, pounding on the door with my fists. A few seconds later, the police appeared on the second floor. "Where is she?" one of them asked. "In the bathroom," Damien muttered. "But I don't understand how." "Step aside," Officer McCormick ordered. I heard the key turn in the lock. The door opened, and I saw two uniformed police officers. Behind them stood Winifred with a worried look on her face. "Mrs. Crispin, are you all right?" asked the senior officer. "Yes, I'm fine now," I replied, coming out of the bathroom. "Thank you for coming." Damien stood nearby, his face pale. "Mom, what's going on? How did you get locked in?" His attempt to feign surprise looked pathetic. His hands were shaking, His voice was breaking. Alcohol and stress were taking their toll. Your son locked me in there an hour and a half ago, I said, looking him straight in the eye. He said I was ruining the party. That's not true, Damien exclaimed. I didn't lock anyone in. Mom, maybe you're confused. Confused? I felt anger rising inside me. You pushed me into the bathroom and turned the key. You said I was getting in the way. And then someone searched my bedroom. The police officers exchanged glances. The younger one took out a notebook and pen. Mrs. Crispin, tell us in detail what happened. I briefly recounted the events of the evening, from the start of the party to the moment I was locked in. I also mentioned the overheard conversation about the old woman living too long. Damien stood nearby the whole time, growing paler and paler. It's not true, he repeated. My mother has memory problems. She often gets confused and forgets things. I have an excellent memory, I replied sharply, and I remember every word you said. Winifred came up to me and took my hand. Estelle, I was so worried. When you called, thank God you're okay. Thank you for believing me, I said, and for bringing help. Officer McCormick was examining the lock on the bathroom door. The key turns easily. The lock is in working order. To lock the door from the outside, it would have had to be done deliberately. Maybe the door jammed? Damien suggested. These old locks sometimes. Mr. Crispin, the policeman interrupted him. The lock is in perfect working order, and your mother claims that you locked her in deliberately. At that moment, footsteps were heard from below. Clarissa appeared on the second floor. She was dressed in a robe, her hair tousled as if she had been awakened. What's going on? She asked, feigning sleepy confusion. Damn, who are these people? The police, he replied grimly. The police? Clarissa looked at me, then at her husband. But why? What happened? Her acting was better than Damien's, but I could see the insincerity in her every gesture. She knew perfectly well what was going on. Your husband locked his mother in the bathroom, the younger officer explained. Where have you been for the last 2 hours? Sleeping, Clarissa replied quickly. I have to work early tomorrow, so I went to bed right after the guests left. And Estelle was locked in? How is that possible? It's very simple, I said. Damien lured me upstairs under the pretext of showing me where the towels were, and then locked me in. That's absurd, Clarissa exclaimed. Why would he do that? Estelle, maybe you just… And then someone searched my room, I interrupted. They were looking for documents, rummaging through drawers and closets. The police officers exchanged glances again. May we see your bedroom? Officer McCormick asked. We went into my room. Even in the dim light, it was clear that someone had been there. The drawers of the dresser were not fully pulled out. The clothes in the closet were not hanging as I had left them, and the items on the dressing table were in a different order. Someone has definitely been searching here, stated the senior officer. Mr. Crispin, do you have an explanation? I don't know what you're talking about, muttered Damien. No one was searching for anything. Then who else could have done it? I asked. The guests left, only the two of you remained, and while I was locked up, someone methodically went through my things. Clarissa was silent, but I could see how tensely she was swallowing. Her calmness was feigned, hiding her panic. The junior officer wrote everything down in his notebook. Then he asked, Mrs. Crispin, what exactly could they have been looking for in your belongings? Documents, probably, I replied. House deeds, bank accounts, maybe a will, although the original is kept by a notary. Do you have reason to believe that your son and daughter-in-law are interested in your financial affairs? I told them about the conversation I had overheard, about Damien and Clarissa's strange behavior throughout the evening, about how they had tried to get rid of me. The police listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "It's all a lie," Damien said when I finished. "My mother, she's been forgetful and suspicious lately. She's making up conspiracies that don't exist." "Then explain how she ended up locked in the bathroom," Officer McCormick demanded. "The lock can only be closed from the outside." "Maybe she locked herself in and forgot," Clarissa suggested, "and then decided that we locked her in." "The lock can be opened from the inside without a key," the policeman reminded her. "If she had locked herself in, she could have come out at any time." Clarissa's theory fell apart, but she didn't give up. "Maybe the lock jammed." "We already checked," the officer interrupted her. "The lock is in perfect working order." Winifred had been silent all this time, but now she couldn't hold back. "Estelle remembers everything that happens to her perfectly well. I talk to her every day. She has no memory problems." "You don't live with her," Damien objected. "You don't see how she—" "I do see," I said firmly. "And I remember very well how my own son called me an old woman who had lived too long, and how he pushed me into the bathroom and turned the key." Damien opened his mouth to argue, but Officer McCormick stopped him. "Mr. Crispin, we have witness testimony. We have evidence of a search of the room. This is serious." "What does that mean?" Clarissa asked. "It means we're filing a report and turning the case over to the district attorney," replied the junior officer. "Unlawful imprisonment is a criminal offense." Damien and Clarissa's faces paled even more. They clearly hadn't expected the case to take such a serious turn. "But she's my mother," Damien muttered. "This is a family dispute. Family relationships do not give you the right to deprive a person of their liberty," Officer McCormick said sternly. "You locked up an elderly woman against her will. That is a crime, regardless of your relationship to her." The police continued to ask questions for some time, examining the rooms and recording details. Winifred stayed close to me, asking from time to time how I was feeling. "Fine," I replied, "now that everything has been cleared up." In fact, I felt a strange mixture of relief and bitterness. Relief that the nightmare was over, and bitterness at the realization of how low my son had sunk. When the report was completed, Officer McCormick turned to me and said, "Mrs. Crispin, would you like us to arrest your son?" I looked at Damien. He stood slumped, avoiding my gaze. A 45-year-old man who behaved like a teenager caught stealing. "Not yet," I said after a pause, "but I want the report filed." "Will do," the officer nodded. "And I advise you to consult a lawyer. You might want to consider a restraining order." Damien raised his head. "Mom, you're not going to—" "I don't know," I replied honestly. "Not yet." After the report was filed, Officer McCormick suggested conducting a more detailed search of the house. "Mrs. Crispin, if you don't mind, we'd like to document all traces of the search. It will help with further investigation." I nodded. "Of course. Do whatever you think is necessary." Damien and Clarissa exchanged glances. Their eyes showed anxiety and confusion. The plan they had so carefully prepared was falling apart before their eyes, and they didn't know how to stop it. The junior officer took out a camera and began photographing my bedroom. Every drawer that had been moved, every item that was out of place, was captured by the lens. Winifred helped me point out the changes, where things were supposed to be, what had been moved. "This drawer always slides all the way in," I explained, pointing to the dresser. "And now it's pulled out 2 centimeters, and the scarf was lying differently." "What's stored here?" asked the police officer, pointing to the bottom drawer. "Documents, insurance policies, medical certificates, copies of bank statements." I opened the drawer and examined the contents. "The folders have been rearranged. This blue one should be first, but now it's third." Clarissa stood in the doorway, watching the inspection. "Maybe Estelle just forgot how she arranged the papers." she said with feigned concern. At that age, memory sometimes fails. My memory is perfectly fine, I replied sharply, and I remember exactly where everything was. Officer McCormick turned to Clarissa. Mrs. Crispin, where were you when your mother-in-law was locked in the bathroom? I told you I was asleep, Clarissa repeated. I was tired after work, so I went to bed early. What time exactly? Clarissa hesitated for a second. Around, around 11, when most of the guests had left. But the guests left much later, I objected. The last ones left around 1 in the morning. Well, maybe 11:30. Clarissa corrected herself. I don't remember exactly. Winifred shook her head. Estelle, she's lying. You said on the phone that music was still playing downstairs when you were locked in. The police officer noted the contradictions in their statements. Then he turned to Damien. What did you do after you, in your words, discovered that your mother was locked in? Damien nervously ran his hand through his hair. Well, at first I didn't understand what was going on. I thought maybe the door was jammed. I tried to open it, but it didn't work. And then what? I decided to wait until morning. I thought I'd call a locksmith if it didn't open on its own. So you didn't try to free your mother immediately? The officer clarified. Didn't you look for a spare key or try to take the door off its hinges? Damien remained silent. His version seemed increasingly unconvincing. Is there a spare key? The police officer asked me. Yes, in the kitchen, in the desk drawer, I replied. We went downstairs. There was indeed a spare key to the bathroom in the desk drawer. It was in the same place it always was, which meant Damien hadn't even tried to look for it. Interesting, Officer McCormick remarked. The key is in plain sight and you didn't know about it? I forgot, Damien muttered. Meanwhile, the junior officer was examining the living room. There are signs of a search here, too, he said, pointing to the bookshelf. The books aren't tightly packed. There are gaps between them. It looks like someone checked to see if there were any hiding places behind them. I walked over to the shelf. Indeed, my books were not arranged as usual. Some were slightly pushed forward, the order disrupted. I always arrange my books very neatly, I explained, by size and subject. What could have been hidden behind the books? The police officer asked. Nothing, I replied, but they probably decided to check. Clarissa tried to intervene. Maybe one of the guests just took one to read? At 2 in the morning? The officer remarked skeptically. And checked the entire shelf? The search continued in other parts of the house. Boxes had been moved in the storage room, and in Robert's study, which I hardly ever used, someone had opened the drawers of the desk. Everywhere there were subtle but distinctive signs of someone else's presence. It looks like they searched very thoroughly, Officer McCormick stated, and they were looking for something specific. What do you think it was? I thought about it. Probably the will, or the deeds to the house, maybe bank papers to see how much money I have. Do you have a will? Yes, drawn up by a notary, but only a copy is kept at home. And the house is in your name? Yes. My husband and I bought it in 1972, and after his death, the house passed to me. Damien and Clarissa listened to this conversation, trying to look indifferent, but I could see how tense they became when the will was mentioned. Does your son know the contents of the will? The police officer asked. No, I replied. That's my personal business. Damien couldn't take it anymore. Mom, I'm your only child. Naturally, I'll get everything. Nothing is natural, I replied coldly. I have the right to dispose of my property as I see fit. But I'm your son, he exclaimed. Who else can you leave everything to? That's my business, I repeated. Officer McCormick wrote down this exchange as well. So, a possible motive for the search is a desire to find out the contents of the will and the financial situation of the victim. What other motive could there be? Clarissa protested. Damien is Estelle's son. He has a right to know. No one has the right to search through other people's belongings, the police officer replied sharply, and certainly not to deprive a person of their liberty. Winifred approached me. Estelle, do you remember saying that they had been acting strangely in recent weeks? Maybe we should tell the police? I nodded. Yes, lately they've been whispering a lot, discussing something behind my back. And yesterday, Clarissa said that tomorrow morning we should talk about the future and some plans. What plans? The officer asked. She didn't explain. She just said that a lot would change. The police officers exchanged glances. It sounds like they were preparing for something serious, remarked the junior officer. Clarissa tried to explain. I just wanted to discuss our housing plans. We can't live with Estelle forever. Why couldn't you discuss it with me? I asked. Why keep it a secret? We weren't keeping it a secret, she replied weakly. Then what exactly did you want to talk about tomorrow morning? Clarissa fell silent. She realized that any answer could be used against her. Damien decided to take the initiative. Okay, I'll tell you the truth. Yes, we were looking for your will. Yes, we wanted to know what would happen to the house after, well, in the future. Why? Officer McCormick asked. We want to buy our own place, Damien said. But we need money for that. I thought maybe Mom could help us. Give us some of the money now instead of waiting. He didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. They wanted to get their inheritance while she was still alive. And for that, you had to lock me in the bathroom? I asked sarcastically. No, it was an accident. I was drunk. I wasn't thinking. Lies, I said firmly. You were thinking perfectly well, and you told Trevor that the old woman was living too long. Damien turned pale. You were eavesdropping? I overheard it by accident, and I realized what you think of me. The police officers listened intently to this conversation. Officer McCormick made a few more notes, then turned to Clarice. And what is your role in this case? None, she replied quickly. I didn't know anything about Damien's plans. But tomorrow morning, you were the one who wanted to talk to Mrs. Crispin about plans and the future. Clarice realized she was contradicting herself. Well, Damien and I were discussing the possibility of asking Estelle for help with housing, but that's a normal family request. A normal request doesn't require a preliminary search and deprivation of liberty, the policeman remarked. When the police left, a heavy silence hung over the house. It was almost 4 in the morning, but no one was thinking about sleep. Damien and Clarissa stood in the hallway, as if hesitant to enter the living room. I sat in my chair and, for the first time in a long time, felt like I was in control. Winifred settled down on the sofa next to me. Estelle, are you sure you want to stay here tonight? Let's go to my place and we'll figure it out in the morning. No, I replied firmly. This is my home, and I'm not going to run away from it. Over the long years of my marriage, I had become accustomed to avoiding conflict, smoothing over rough edges, and compromising for the sake of family harmony. Robert was a gentle man, and I considered it my duty to maintain harmony in the home. This habit remained after his death, especially in my relationship with Damien. I excused his shortcomings, turned a blind eye to his selfishness, and tolerated his disrespect. But tonight changed everything. When your own son locks you up like a criminal, when he calls you an old woman who has lived too long, the time for compromise is over. Damien finally decided to enter the living room. He looked 10 years older. His face was gray, his eyes red, his hands trembling from stress and a hangover. Mom, I need to talk to you. You can talk, I replied, but in front of Winifred. The time for secrets and private conversations is over. He sat down uncertainly on the edge of the sofa, away from us. Mom, I understand that you're angry, but let's not make a tragedy out of it. Yes, I was drunk. Yes, I behaved badly. But nothing terrible happened, did it? Nothing terrible? I looked at him in amazement. You locked me in the bathroom for an hour and a half. You searched my things. You called me an old woman who lives too long. And you think that's nothing serious? Well, about the old woman? That was a stupid thing to say when I was drunk. I didn't mean it. What did you mean? Damien fell silent, realizing that any explanation would only make the situation worse. Clarissa entered the living room. She had managed to tidy herself up, comb her hair, put on decent clothes, but the fatigue and stress were evident on her face. Estelle, let's discuss this calmly. We're all nervous saying things we shouldn't. Discuss it calmly? Winifred repeated. After what you've done. What have we done? Clarissa tried to take the initiative. Yes, Damien was drunk and behaved foolishly. But calling the police? This is a family matter. I got up from my chair and walked over to the window. It was starting to get light outside, the first rays of the sun illuminating the empty street. A new day, a new life. And the first thing I had to do was dot the I's and cross the T's. Damien, I said without turning around, how long have you been planning to search my room? I wasn't planning. Don't lie. You and Clarissa were exchanging glances and whispering all evening. This was planned in advance. There was silence. Then Clarissa said quietly, Okay, yes, we wanted to look at your documents. We wanted to understand what our prospects were. Okay, I said calmly. Now let's talk about your prospects. Tomorrow, more precisely, this morning, you're moving out of my house. What? Damien jumped up. Mom, you can't. I can, and I will. You've been living here for 6 months, not paying rent, not working, and now you're searching through my things. Enough. But we have nowhere to go, Clarissa exclaimed. That's your problem, I replied. 6 months ago, I offered you temporary accommodation until Damien found a job. But he's not looking for work, and instead of gratitude, I get humiliation. The rest of the night passed in heavy silence. I sat in my chair by the window and felt at peace for the first time in a long time. 70 is the age when you can finally live for yourself, not for ungrateful relatives. No one will call me an old woman who lives too long anymore, because I intend to live a long time and live well.